So we know that there's a lot of interesting dynamics that happen around mealtime. There's been a lot of research done around mealtime where they put video cameras in people's houses and watch mealtimes and then code and analyze. So these guys had 19 kids with feeding disorders and then 26 without. And they ranked positive and negative behaviors of parent and children observed during the feedings. And the parents of the feeding disorder children demonstrated higher numbers of negative vague instructions, vague positive instructions, negative physical contact, which you can imagine what that is, negative prompting, negative eating comments, and negative social instructions. And what was really interesting about this study was that the vague instructions were particularly likely to be associated with increased food refusal and decreased chewing. Decreased chewing. And my theory, knowing all these kids that I've worked with for so many years, is that one, either they don't have the skills and so they just stop eating, or two, maybe they feel like, if I stop chewing, I can't take another bite. There's food in my mouth, so I don't have to take another bite. Kotler and Cohen in 2001 said risk factors for the later development of eating disorders comprise eating conflicts, struggles with food, and unpleasant meals in early childhood. And I don't know if you guys have read up on some of the eating disorders literature, but they are on the rise in boys and girls, and they're starting much younger. I've heard as young as 6 or 7 years old. Really young. These kids are presenting with true kind of body image type eating disorders, which is unheard of before fairly recently. And so what we know is that kids are really, really plastic, right? They're very, you can shape them negatively or positively. And so we really want to think about how we're struggling around food and what those meal times look like. And when I talk to picky teenagers, picky adults, they tell me that meal times were really unpleasant as kids and that they just hated them. I've heard some really awful stories. So we want to think about what that context looks like. And how do we miss this context in relationships? So a lot of parents don't really understand what we do as therapists, and I think it's our job to kind of teach them what we do, but we are taught to kind of address feeding medically, right? So we have this medical approach to feeding in general, which is excellent when we have to know things about dysphagia and medically complex children and all of that. But we also are using standardized tools to drive assessment. We're breaking down tasks into manageable parts. We need measurability for outcomes, obviously, for insurance and all of those things. But you want to think about it like, does this replace the basics? Can we get back to the basics of what feeding is and then build on that? So that's kind of where I want to go with this. Because we're relationship experts. Like, we are communication experts. Because relationships are built on communication, right? Relationships don't happen if there's no communication. So we really need to think about, we address the meaning of communication and intent within a relationship before we talk about articulation and syntax, right? We're not trying to work on, the child's R's before they have intent, right? Before communication intent is there. But we get stuck on oral motor, we get stuck on, kind of thinking about some of those pieces, and we have to think about how much of a relationship expert we are, a developmental expert. This was a very interesting study that came out recently, and they said that children with language impairments are more than 3 times more likely to have earlier occurring feeding swallowing difficulty when compared with the general population. It's kind of a big deal, right? So I always teach my colleagues and my students that if you're doing a language evaluation, you need to do a feeding observation too. Have a snack with your child when you're doing an evaluation, just to see what's going on, because it's very interesting when I do a language evaluation and the parent has said nothing about feeding, they are more than likely to say, oh yeah, he's really not a very good eater, or he's really super messy, or yeah, he can't drink out of the cup yet. Isn't that weird? And they've not thought to mention it. And so it's something we want to be thinking about when you're doing just a speech language evaluation as well. The possible explanations that they gave in their study was that food transition and food selectivity were the most frequently occurring things noted. Mealtime interactions are an important source of caregiver-child communication, stimulation, and social interaction, right? So during mealtimes, parents are typically talking to their children. They're having a lot of interactions around mealtimes. Oral motor difficulties in chewing and sucking might influence later neurodevelopmental outcomes. So there's also a lot of research looking at children that end up being extremely picky eaters later had different rates of sucking as infants. So there's definitely a correlation there that we see in quite a few studies. And then the difficulties in feeding, swallowing, and speech language represent subtle sensory and motor impairments that are distributed across seemingly independent processes. So again, that larger context is really important. So thinking about how a child is developing in all of these areas and how that impacts the other. So if a child is not eating well, is the parent doing less talking because they're so concerned about every bite that's going in the child's mouth? Or are they doing a lot more directive talking versus communicating with the child, doing more kind of social learning? They're doing more, you need to take a bite, that kind of thing. So we want to think about how that's affecting the child. So this is my little guy who came for feeding problems but had a pretty significant language disorder that was undiagnosed.
I've never seen, this is almost shocking to me, to be honest with you.
You want another bite? You're doing great.
So I don't know if you caught what Dad said. He said, this is almost shocking to me, to be honest with you. This is the first time he'd ever seen him chew. He was eating pound cake, and we caught it on video. It was his first time chewing. He had done steps with us, and he had gotten to the point where, like, he could chew. He just didn't chew on food yet. And so this was the first time he chewed, and Dad was like, oh my gosh, he chewed. Oh my gosh. And then he wouldn't eat it again, of course. But he had a pretty significant language disorder. Yeah, so definitely comorbidity there with some kids.